Hello guys, it's been a while, but we are ready to begin our next unit. This unit's going to dive into all the differences between the North and the South as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. We're going to focus in this unit on the about 30 to 40 years right before the Civil War started. For today, though, we're going to really just focus on the differences between the two main regions of the United States at the time, which are the North and the South. The North and South just both developed very differently from each other, almost immediately after the Civil War and then through into the 1800s. There were just a lot of different issues to divide them, and oftentimes whenever there was an issue in the country where there were two different sides that you could choose from, the North and the South very often found themselves on opposite sides. Starting way back in 1790 with the Three-Fifths Compromise, where the South wanted part of their slave population to count towards the total population of their state, and that way they would be able to get more votes in Congress and be able to have more power. Now, states like up in the North, like Massachusetts, who had no slaves, it didn't really affect them that much, but states like North Carolina or Virginia or South Carolina, where slavery makes up almost half of its population, it drastically increased the number of people that were added to their population, therefore the more votes that they got. And they used those votes and that power to keep slavery going in the United States and be able to hold on to it longer. And then years later, with the Missouri Compromise in the 1800s, it again just kind of kept slavery going and didn't really change anything. It did limit how far slavery could go. At the time that the Missouri Compromise was created, we did not own the territory that was Mexico at the time, and the territory that we take, that's California and Texas and all of that other stuff that we talked about in our last unit. And so the northern states were more willing to agree to it because it didn't look like that much. And then later on, we had something called the Nullification Crisis, and we kind of touched on that a little bit. That was where a bunch of the different states, especially in the South, wanted to be able to ignore the tariff because they felt like the tariff hurt the South more than it helped it, and then it actually benefited the North more than it did the South. And so these are the different states. It's a map that shows how the different states felt about the tariff. The ones that are blue are the ones that were kind of split down the middle. They didn't really know how to feel about it. The green states are the ones that were very much in favor of this tariff. And then red are the ones that were very against. And you can see here, it's almost the exact same states that are going to become our Confederacy and Union states. It's split almost down the middle. There are a few states that are going to join the Confederacy that are colored green on here, like Virginia is going to be a Confederate state. But it's almost like with just a couple exceptions like Virginia, almost the exact same. But it wasn't just the people of the states that felt that way. Even in the government, it's almost like shot for shot. The ones that are green are the ones that had their House of Representatives voted yes on the tariff. Red is no, and yellow is that they chose not to vote or there weren't enough people living in that area to have a House of Representative. And then later on, people disagreed about the Mexican-American War in the North and in the South when we added all of this territory. And if the Missouri Compromise still stands, then a decent chunk of that new territory is going to become slave states. And that's how we talked about this word sectionalism before. It's where you kind of put your interests and your state's needs over the entire country. Like if it doesn't benefit your state, then it doesn't matter. We had a bunch of different issues like this that were splitting the country, such as abolitionists versus slaveholders were a really big one. Once California came into the Union, America became even more divided. The annexation of the Western Territory intensified the slavery debate because of the Missouri Compromise, and they started playing around with the idea of popular sovereignty. There was this new movement going on, especially in the South, that states should be able to vote on whether or not they become slave states or free states. It shouldn't just be a line, like if more states want to become slave states, then let them vote on it and let the people decide. Sectionalism really came to a head and became very obvious, like what specific issues the nation was divided over with the Compromise of 1850. Those who are in class, you'll have a little graphic organizer to glue into your notebook. So you're going to want to glue that in and copy this down. So the Compromise of 1850 has several different parts. The first one is that it's going to give popular sovereignty to New Mexico and Utah, which means those two states will get to vote on whether or not they become slave states or free states. It also let California come in as a free state, and then passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. We'll talk more about what this law was as we go into the Underground Railroad and other issues with slavery. But for the most part, what you mostly need to know about it right now is that it's going to make it a lot more difficult for runaway slaves to get away, and it's going to allow the people who were helping them run away get punished, like serve actual jail time for this stuff. It's also going to solve the Texas and New Mexico border dispute. Those two new territories could not agree about where Texas's territory ended and where New Mexico began. And so if you look at a map of New Mexico and Texas, you can see there's very straight lines dividing New Mexico and Texas, and this is the reason why. And it also banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. This was something, because when you make a compromise, you have to give some things up in order to get some things back. So the North and the free states were willing to accept the Fugitive Slave Act and the popular sovereignty issue in exchange for banning the slave trade in the capital and admitting California as a free state guaranteed. They were willing to accept the other things because they were going to get those two things out of it. The North and the South are also very different, like just geographically. In the North, and we've talked about this before, like way back in the second 9 weeks, so it's a good review. It's very cold and snowy. They have a very short growing season and a long winter, which is going to make farming extremely difficult. So farming's really not going to be what they do to make money. It's going to be more about industry, and we'll talk some more about how that's going to affect the culture there. They also have very fast rivers, which they use to power those factories until they get the steam engines going. They're also going to have really big cities, and like we said before, water power used to run the factories. In the South, it's like the complete opposite. Very long summers and short winters. Lots of rain. I mean, you live in the South, you know what it's like. The soil in most parts of the South is extremely fertile, which means living in the South is great for agriculture. Transportation is also going to be very different and develop very differently in the North and in the South. In the South, it's going to be mostly the steamboats, but in the North, it's going to be the canals and railroads. Railroads existed in the South, but far less than they did in the North. And you'll see maps and charts of that later. Culturally, the North is going to turn to this industrial society, where we have these really big cities and lots of shipping and manufacturing, and people are just living very close together. But in the South, it turned into more of an agrarian society, an agrarian culture, which means they're going to focus on agriculture and farming. The kind of things that they grew in the South are things like rice and sweet potatoes and sugar cane. They also had a lot of plantations, which we talked about before, where they grow lots of cash crops, which is a crop that you grow that's very easy to grow and very easy to harvest. You can grow a ton of it, and you can sell it for a ton of money. So the more of it you can grow, the more money you're going to make. Cotton and tobacco are probably the two biggest cash crops. This house over here on the right-hand side is a really good example of a plantation house. It was this big old mansion, tons of rooms. And again, the reason why you wanted to have your house be as big as possible in the South back in the day is because air conditioning, not a thing yet. And so the bigger the area is, the easier it is to keep it cool, especially in the summer. However, not everybody in the South lived in these giant plantation homes. Most of them were living on small farms. An argument that but just whether or not they lived on a big plantation or a small farm, for the most part, pretty much everybody in the South was in favor of slavery, whether they owned slaves or not. A couple of the big arguments, and this is not me saying that these are good arguments, these are more the excuses that people back then gave, I think is a better way to describe it. They would say that slaves couldn't take care of themselves, like they were doing them a favor, keeping them on the plantations, and in exchange for giving them a place to live, they had to do all this extra work, which is not a good justification for what was going on these plantations. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper in this unit into what it was actually like being a slave in the 1800s in the United States. Because slavery in the United States was very different from slavery in any other country, in any other time period in the history of the world. And we'll dive more into that. We're going to read an autobiography from somebody who was a slave, so you can get it, like, not me telling you, you can get it straight from them. But we'll get into that later. They also would use religion as a justification for slavery, arguing that, like, in the Bible it says it's okay, and that, like, we're the best people. They used all kinds of crazy stuff to justify, like, no, like, God said this is okay, so we're going to do it. In the North, however, slavery wasn't ever really profitable, so that's part of the reason why they had an easier time getting rid of it. But they also had a lot of moral justifications for that as well. They were more into industrialization, which led to huge city growth. The population grew extremely quickly, and we saw something called rural flight happening in the North, which meant everybody was leaving the rural areas, which are like the countryside, and moving into the more urban areas, which are cities. You also had a lot of people from other countries who were moving over here, like, extremely quickly. And this is all going to lead to overcrowding and this cultural mix where you have a lot of different ideas and points of view from all over the world all kind of mixing together, which is going to kind of influence how the North views slavery because they have so many different points of view in one place. As you can see from the picture, the North wasn't exactly the nicest place to live either. It was a lot of air pollution from all these different factories, and living so crowded together meant things like fires would have a lot more damage and sickness would spread a lot more quickly. We talked about the railroads before. This transportation revolution happened because these cities are kind of all over the place in the North, and because of all this manufacturing and shipping and all the stuff that was starting to become really big businesses, they wanted to connect those cities, and they're going to use the railroads to do it. And it's also going to help us to distribute trade goods faster and a lot easier. Railroads are just the perfect solution for all of those problems. We talked about immigration, or we touched on it a second ago. Between 1840 and 1860, so in just 20 years, 4 million immigrants moved to the United States. Most of these people are from Europe, and 3 million of that 4 million are from either Ireland or Germany. And if you look really carefully at this picture, you can see just how many people are crammed onto this boat. But however, despite the fact that they are bringing a bunch of different points of view from other countries, those different points of view are going to lead to a lot of conflict as well when people don't agree, specifically between the Protestants and the Catholics. They're going to have some religious disputes, and it's going to spill over sometimes into violence and carving out different parts of different states, like this is the Catholic area and this is Protestants only and that kind of thing. Immigration, we talked about way back in the first 9 weeks. The things that cause people to move are usually push factors or pull factors. For these immigrants in this time period, some of the push factors were things like starvation, especially in Ireland, where there was an event happening called the Potato Famine, which you can do more research into that. It's very interesting. Poverty, it was a lot easier to start a business or buy a piece of land and make money for yourself to provide for your family in the United States than it was in Europe at the time. And there was a lack of political freedom as well, where you couldn't really, like, vote in other countries. Like, that wasn't a thing. Like, there was the king, and then you had to do whatever the king said, and that was it. But over here in the United States, you got to elect who your local, state, and national government leaders were. Some of the pull factors are things like how much land there was, and more job opportunities, and a lot more freedom and equality for most people. But just like any other time period, there are people who kind of reacted negatively to the amount of immigration coming into the United States. The people back then who were against these immigrants were called Nativists. They were what they called native-born Americans, meaning that they were born in the United States. One of the worries that they had was that they were going to be losing jobs to immigrants who were willing to work for lower wages. They also wanted to keep immigrants and Catholics out of public office. and they're going to work their hardest to get the representatives to make it a lot more difficult to become a citizen. They're going to increase it from the original 10 years, which it's 10 years today, but they're going to make it so you had to live in the United States for 21 years before you become a citizen. That is going to change later on in American history. Today, you have to live in the United States for 10 years before you can become a citizen. But there were just a lot of political cartoons from both sides of this immigration issue that we're going to look at really quickly. So you can see in this one, there are two men wearing different alcohol barrels. One says Irish whiskey and the other one says lager beer. And those two are supposed to represent Irish and German immigrants. And you can kind of right off the bat see one of the stereotypes that they put on these two different groups is that, oh, they're just a bunch of alcoholics and they're carrying clubs and there's a fight breaking out. And it seems like they're the ones who started that fight. So they're troublemakers and they're alcoholics and they're running away carrying a ballot box between them, implying that they are going to steal the election. These immigrants are going to steal it and make it so that the United States citizens, like, the normal people, don't get what they want, which is not a good way to look at it. This is another one that was kind of on the pro-immigration side or the anti-immigration side, depending on what message you take from it. Here we have Uncle Sam, who's kind of blocking the gateway into the United States. You can see on that pillar, it says United States of America, admission free, walk-ins welcome. Implying that, like, yeah, we accept anybody from anywhere, but looking at Uncle Sam, that does not seem to be the case. And you also have a person who's supposed to represent somebody from another country, an immigrant, and he's carrying a lot of baggage. And if you look at what it says in there, it says things like disease and poverty and anarchy, Sabbath desecration, and all this stuff. Trying to imply like these were the things that nativists were worried that immigrants were bringing into the country. So despite the fact that we like advertised ourselves as being like very opening and welcoming and like everybody can live here, that was not necessarily the case for these guys. This one is a very anti-nativist political cartoon. See, we have this guy here in the bottom right who looks like he has just moved here from another country. He's walking down the gangplank of a ship. And then you have all these fancy guys who look very rich and well-dressed who are trying to stop him from coming over. But if you look at their shadows, they don't match the people that the shadows are coming from. What this political cartoon was trying to say is that if you go back in your history, like, your grandparents probably weren't from the United States, or your great-grandparents, like somebody had to move here from another country. Like your ancestors are immigrants and they were allowed to come to the United States and benefit from all the advantages that they got from moving here. So why are you trying to prevent other people from having the same opportunities? And it was just something that is going to split the country between the nativists and the non-nativists. Urban life in the North is going to have a lot of industry and something new that kind of pops up called the middle class. The middle class was this economic group. It was this level between, you weren't really rich, but you weren't like, starving poor either. So people like merchants and craftsmen, manufacturers, professionals, people who like own their own businesses, they start to gain more power in government. For everybody else, though, life was not so easy breezy. It was very crowded in the cities, and we see these apartment buildings called tenements pop up. They were very poorly designed, and they would crowd a lot of people into them. Like you would have 7 families possibly at a time living in these very small apartment buildings. There weren't really any good public services at the time like we have now. There was no clean water, and there was no garbage man who's going to come by and pick up your garbage, so it would just be out in the street. They tended to be centers of crime, and there was no like police force or fire department to help these people. But we did get a lot of advances in communication, transportation, industry, and banking. The North is going to turn to like our business center of the country. Slavery had been outlawed in most of these states, so labor is mostly going to be coming from immigrants and unskilled workers in these factories. It's going to be an increase in the number of labor unions and leisure time. And because of all these different issues, the North is going to see a lot more social reform than the South is. Issues like slavery, women's rights, religion, environment, education, literature, art, alcoholism, prison, the middle class, and especially women and African Americans living in the North, tended to be the ones who were pushing these reforms forward and leading these efforts. Some of these movements are like these three. Abolitionism was this movement to try to abolish or get rid of slavery. Romanticism is very similar to what we've talked about before with Transcendentalism, which we'll talk about again in just a second, where you kind of like reject the established rules and you look for the simple life and be one with nature. Transcendentalism also has a focus on nature, but they also wanted you to kind of rise above material things. Like they were very much like Thomas Jefferson, like you go out and you live out in the nature, out in the woods, and you don't let like material things get you down, things like that. In the South, manufacturing and industry is not their thing. So we have the cotton gin, which is going to be a huge boom for both the North and the South. The Southern economy is going to get to the point where it depends entirely on cotton, and it by itself is going to increase the demand for slave labor. It's cheap, easy to store, it's easy to transport because it's so light, you can transport a lot of it, and it's going to lead to a lot of agricultural innovations. Tobacco and cotton, no matter which one you're growing, require a lot of land. So the Southerners are constantly looking out west for more land and more slave territories to include in the Union and strengthen their position in Congress, and then also just to make more money. Because again, the more you can plant, the more money you can make. The Southern economy is going to be impacted by that tariff that we talked about before. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, which means that if you're buying from outside the country, it's now going to be a lot more expensive. And it's going to make the South angry because they're going to feel like the North is going to keep getting richer while keeping the prices high for the South. And to kind of show you, in the United States, cloth costs $6. And let's say it costs Great Britain, or like if it's from Great Britain, it costs $5. The manufacturing costs are more expensive in the United States. Shipping costs are slightly more expensive for Britain. However, without the tariff, cloth from Great Britain would still only cost like $5.50, $5.75. But with that tariff added onto it, it's now more expensive than if you bought it from the United States. And that's what makes the South so upset, is now no matter who they're buying from, it's more than what they had been paying before, like by a pretty good bit. In the South, most cities are going to be built on the Atlantic coast, but then as trade on the rivers kind of expands, we're going to see port cities like New Orleans and Charleston and Savannah start seeing a lot of growth. Cities were very few and far between. In Georgia in 1860, the population density was 18 people per square mile, meaning within like 1 square mile, on average in Georgia, there were 18 people living there. Compare that to Massachusetts, which is a much smaller state, there were 153 people per square mile. Wealthy Southerners were mainly plantation owners. And while the North is developing canals, railroads, and highways, the South is not. There are just a lot of political issues that start to divide the North and South and just really kind of put this division out on display for everybody to see. Such as slavery is the main one. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, we'll talk about more about those later, are going to bring attention to slavery and the fact that slavery is very slowly spreading out west, and how do we feel about that? Sectionalism is dividing the nation with all these different issues, to the point that in Philadelphia, these two different political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, have like an actual like brawl out in the streets to try to decide this election happening in this one town, and it's going to result in one person dying, several people getting injured, and an entire block of buildings getting burned down. And then there's going to be a man named John Brown who's going to really just put it out on display how divided the nation is, to the point where John Brown's going to do some crazy stuff, and depending on what side you were on this issue, very much kind of influence the way that you viewed what he did. But we'll talk about him later on in this unit. If you haven't already, there is going to be a link that will be posted on Google Classroom later today. So make sure you check if you're kind of checking this later in the day, where you can kind of take this dialect quiz, where it's going to ask you a bunch of different questions about how you pronounce or what you call certain things. And it's going to try to use that information to figure out where you're from. And it's pretty accurate. And it's just a way to kind of show you how different parts of the United States can be so divided, even though we're the same country, like how we can be so different. Make sure you do the North versus South reader as a homework assignment, and I will see you guys later.